Say the Apostle Paul walked in the back door, fired up, and he begins saying, "You got a question? Let's hear it." This book of 1 Corinthians is filled with questions. Questions that the Corinthian church had asked Paul that now he is answering. We're not sure whether they liked his answers either. Perhaps that's why there's 2 Corinthians.
Welcome to The God-Centered Life with Josh Moody. We're continuing our series called To the Church of God, taking a look at 1 Corinthians. Today, it's chapter 9, verses 19 through 27. In a study we're calling Under the Law. Josh Moody is senior pastor of College Church located in Wheaton, Illinois, and I'm your host, Todd Bastide. Well, there are some statements in today's passage that, if not dealt with in context, can get sideways pretty quickly. For instance, all things to all men.
Yeah, and so it is significant and important that we look at the context of the passage and not grab a text out of its surrounding context and just misuse it. And so we need to study the Bible, and that's what we're passionate about at God-Centered Life, and do it in context.
Well, take a seat, because that's exactly what we're going to do as we head into 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, verses 19 through 27. Here's Josh.
Well, good morning. Do you like questions? My daughter loves questions. She has questions about everything. She doesn't always like the answers. When she was 2, she first asked me about the Trinity, which was a bit of a surprise to me. I remember the day we were in our kitchen, and I said to her, "Jesus is God." And she said, "But Daddy, isn't the Father God?" I was like, "Oh, okay." And so we had a long conversation over 2 weeks, and I think we got over that hurdle, I think. Questions. Do you have questions you would love to ask God? How about Paul? Say the Apostle Paul walked in the back door. Small guy, probably even more bald than I am. Very passionate Mediterranean, something like that. A Jew, that's easier. Fired up. And he begins saying, "You got a question? Let's hear it." This book of 1 Corinthians is filled with questions. Questions that the Corinthian church had asked Paul that now he is answering. We're not sure whether they liked his answers either. Perhaps that's why there's 2 Corinthians. The question that is being asked now, that is on the table now, is a question about food. Food sacrificed to idols. Food with a religious significance, that is. And we're in the midst of Paul's rather lengthy answer. It's verse 19 of chapter 9. Let's hear God's word. Will you stand with me as we read it? Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Do please sit down. Thank you. Questions. What are you saying here, Paul? Why is this so important? I thought we were talking about food. And whatever it is that you are saying, what does that mean in practice? You've used a lot of rhetorical language, but how do I actually do that in my daily life, in the city, in Corinth? You're a tent maker, Paul. Surely you know what it means to put things into practice. Well, let's take the first question. What is this passage saying? It seems perhaps pretty easy on the outset, but it's not really as easy as many people have thought. Look at verse 22. This is the key difficulty. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. Note, it is not all. Paul never had an ambition to save all people, but some. It is a classic example, this text, of how when we do not pay attention to the context, we can come up with all sorts of funky interpretations. Some people seem to think that this means that you can do, practically speaking, whatever you like, as long as you get the results in terms of more and more people sitting in our churches, more and more people signing on the dotted line, more and more people to add to the statistics of the Christian church. Other people on the other extreme, if you like, seem to feel that this means that you can only do what Paul did to the Jew, to the person under the law, to those not under the law. That is, this has a purely what is called salvation historical point. That is, in the Old Testament, before Jesus came, these things were real, but now Jesus has come, they have been dispensed with. And so it doesn't seem to have much in the way of practical application other than a thanksgiving that we can eat pork. What is the right way through that? Well, first of all, we need to use our minds a little bit. For in that verse 22, he says all things, and so the person on one end of the spectrum of interpreting it could easily come back and say, well, surely that means everything. All things means everything. Well, let's think together. Say you were going on a run this week. You were feeling especially spry. And there you were pounding down Central Avenue. Is it Central Avenue? Or was that New Haven? Anyway, a street in Wheaton. You're pounding along and you're working up a good sweat and you're thinking to yourself, I am working off all those Easter eggs. I am going to. And you can feel the pounds just evaporating. Someone sees you running, he's a friend, he comes up to you at the end of the race as you're leaning on your porch, practically expiring, and he says to you, you gave that everything. What does he mean? He does not mean you literally gave it everything. Everything. The moon, your cat, everything? No, he means that you look like death warmed up. And maybe you should see your cardiologist. You gave it everything.
Okay, so what does Paul mean by this phrase? Coming up. But first, a reminder that we're completely listener-supported. We would love to have a partnership with you. If you're enjoying these studies and can help us continue this work, that would be very encouraging to us. You can help us in that way by going to our website, godcenteredlife.org. Thank you in advance for your partnership. Back into 1 Corinthians, here's Josh.
What Paul means by everything is similarly defined by the context. To the Jew, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became like those under the law. To those without the law, I became like those without the law. To the weak, I became the weak. Context. If you want to trace the origin of most wrong interpretations of the Bible, they come down to people ignoring context. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text, which is a precursor to a disaster. Context. He did not become every practical thing. He did not become every moral thing. He became every Jew thing, every under law thing, every not under law thing, every weak thing. That's what he means. Now, we'll think through what that means in a moment, but first, just understand that what he is saying by everything is not literally everything. Whatever it means, it does not mean you can do absolutely anything to get your neighbor to come to Cottage Church, or to get the unbelievers in a mission situation to become believers. Anything. No. It means these particular things. Now, if you're not a Christian here this morning, I hope that encourages you. We are not going to manipulate you. We are not going to lie to you. If there is a difficulty in Christianity, we're going to be straightforward about it and say, look, this is the closest we can come to understanding this issue. We think it's a better explanation than any of the others, and we're pretty sure it's right. In fact, we know it is, but we're not hiding that there are some difficulties at times for people. There are questions. We do not lie. We do not manipulate. As Paul says explicitly in verse 21, I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. In other words, this everything is not a blank check to do whatever you want as long as someone gets saved at the end of the day. Whatever it means to do all things to win people, it does not mean not following God's law. It does not mean not following Jesus and what he said about the truth will set you free, about loving your neighbor, about turning the other cheek, about not being fake like the Pharisees. It doesn't mean ignoring those things, whatever it means. Now, once you can see that there is a context to this text, it's much easier to see the kind of thing that Paul means. I think that John Calvin was right when he simply said that Paul is not talking about the moral law, he is talking about the ceremonial law. He is talking about sacrifices, food, indeed, drink, indeed, rituals of the Old Testament, ceremonies, and then the week, which is an interesting addition for these Corinthians, as we will see in a moment. And so Paul says, doesn't he, to the Jew, I became a Jew to win the Jews. Well, you've got to remember something. There's Paul. He's rather bald. He's rather short. He's also a Jew. What does it mean for Paul to say, I became a Jew? Well, he already is a Jew. You already are a Jew, Paul. What it means is that though he is free from the ceremonial law, now as a follower of Jesus who declared all foods clean, though he is free from the Jewish ceremonial law, from the law of circumcision, food, drink, and all the rest, yet, here it is, Paul returns to Jerusalem. What does he do? He goes up to the temple to offer Jewish sacrifices. He became a Jew. For the sake of the Jews. Here it is. Paul has just been told and is delivering the conclusion of the gathering of all the leaders of God's people to say that this is the answer to the great crisis of the church about circumcision and not being circumcised. And it is saying that this is not necessary for salvation. A couple of verses later, a chapter or so later, what does he do? Here's Timothy. He wants to recruit Timothy. He's got a lot of potential, has Timothy. He wants him on his side, on his team. He recruits Timothy, but Timothy is a Greek. His father is a Greek at least. He's a Gentile. He has not been circumcised, but Paul was going to a Jewish area where not to have been circumcised would have meant that he would have had less chance to get, as it were, into the pulpit. He would have had less credibility. And so Paul, we are told, for the sake of the Jews, circumcise Timothy. How can he do this? Circumcision is nothing, unless you think it is, in which case Paul will write you a letter like the Galatians. It's no longer necessary, but it can be strategic. They are signs pointing to Jesus, and like a signpost, you no longer need it when you've arrived at the destination. I suppose the classic example today, and I'm going to use a rather risky example. You now know me a little bit and I can get away with it. I think. We will find out. I suppose the classic example today is alcohol. Why is that? Well, not many of us today have other food or drink rules. When I was a missionary in the Republic of Georgia, I don't mean where they all say y'all all the time. I mean in the Caucasus region of the former Soviet Union. When I was in the Republic of Georgia, I discovered that Georgians only ever drank wine after a formal toast. You have to understand the culture. In Georgia, the first missionary to Georgia introduced what Georgians call the cross of wine, the cross of wine. And the reason why they call it the cross of wine was this first missionary, who was a woman, came to that country, and it is said, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt the story, that she found vineyards and vines growing everywhere, and she grabbed a couple of them and she tied them together as branches, and she held up the cross, and she went throughout the land preaching Jesus Christ crucified. And it's the Georgian cross, the cross of wine. And so wine has a very different feel in Georgia than it does to the other Georgia, where they say y'all all the time. Very different. And Georgians only ever drink wine, at least usually in the sort of high culture, when they are toasting, when there's a formal toast. And I discovered that some of these toasts were really quite patriotic, sentimental, even deep. And so in my youthful exuberance, I decided that an interesting and perhaps rather effective way of doing evangelism was to sit down with the locals and offer to give a toast not to Georgia, not to friendship, but to God. Some of these toasts became really quite long. Theirs were too. Some of mine had 3 points. Never a poem. Not quite an altar call, but almost. And nearly always deeply appreciated as I preached the gospel, or, as I thought about it at the time in my youth, toasted the gospel. But you know, at the same stage of life, when I was beginning to learn about public ministry and evangelism and all that sort of thing, same season of life, I also did some evangelism in a nearby country, but this country was a nominally Muslim country. And like all Muslim countries, alcohol is certainly easily available, but it is frowned upon. To drink is to be immoral. I never touched a drop. It would have been a compromise to the gospel. Or it would have been perceived to have been, which in that context was the same thing. Paul is now saying that because of what Christ has done on the cross, to fulfill the law, all these Old Testament ceremonial laws are now in that kind of category. You can do them if you want, but you don't need to, and if you think you need to, you had better not. For it is by faith that we are saved, not by the law. They are signposts now. They are not and were never designed to be the destination. And so that is the theme that runs through the first three of these categories. Those under the law, the Jews, those under the law, that is under the law, those who are God-fearers, as they were called at the time, not born Jews, but converted to Judaism. Those without the law, religious and ceremonial things that are not necessary.
That's Josh Moody, and this is The God-Centered Life. Josh, there's a long-standing sense of honor, at least there was for me growing up in the church, to obey everything found in the Bible. That's what you should do. But today's session says that without understanding the context, we could easily miss the bigger picture.
And people do, don't they? They just grab a verse out of context and make it mean something that it doesn't mean. And it happens in the church. It happens often outside the church. We get accused of believing all sorts of things we don't believe because people don't understand that in the Old Testament there are matters that are in the story that are descriptive but not meant to be prescriptive. And so there's all sorts of subtleties that we need to bear in mind when we read the Bible. But as Paul says to Timothy, to think on these things, and then the Lord will give you insight. So we need a spiritual mind, think and ask for God's help.
We also talked previous lesson about living in such a way that the gospel progresses. One of the other things that Paul said to Timothy is, I'm going into a Jewish community, and without circumcision, the opportunity to get into the pulpit is greatly reduced. That's a pretty significant example of living for the progress of the gospel.
What an amazing thing to do. And it's particularly remarkable because Paul had just been arguing against circumcision, saying it's not necessary. Well, it's not necessary and it's not required. But for the sake of the gospel, there are times when we do things that enable us to open a door or to get into a situation that otherwise we wouldn't. For instance, a missionary may well wear clothes that may not have been their personal preference in order to fit in with the environment where they or avoid certain kinds of food. And these things are not done out of law, but out of gospel sacrifice.
Yeah. So you've got a PhD. And you're what could easily be categorized as a history buff. So context is something that you go pursuing. How does the new believer who's just trying to sort all this out get a better handle of context? What method of study might we recommend to better understand context?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound strange, but I would say just read the Bible. I'm someone who's written quite a lot of books, but don't get confused by a lot of the other books about the Bible. Read the Bible. Read it as it would naturally be interpreted. So if it's a story, read it as a story. If it's a letter, read it as a letter. If it's a history book, read it as a history book. Read the Bible, read it prayerfully, and ask God for help. You know, Todd, whenever I get stuck, the thing that always gives light is when I get on my knees and ask God to help me. So read the Bible and read it prayerfully.
The Bible doesn't need to be defended. It's living and active.
Right.
Excellent. Can't do better than prayerfully taking it in. And our prayer is that reading the Bible would not be an item on the law-based checklist, but instead would be something you long for on a daily basis as you meet God in His Word and sense His presence in your day. If your email inbox fights for top billing each morning, why not sign up for an email from Josh that includes a link to that day's study and a devotional as well? Set that in motion on our website at godcenteredlife.org. Next time, self-slavery.
We live in a church culture where we have imbibed grace and we have made it cheap grace. But you know how you spot a truly free person? They are no longer bound by the biggest slavery of all, which is the self.
Continuing in the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians when we get together next time. GodCenteredLife.org is where you can sign up for that daily email coming your way. And this is your invitation to join us next time, right here for The God-Centered Life with Josh Moody.